Oh, welcome into another episode. Man, we are on a history kick now. I got to say, for the listeners that have been a part of this show since the very beginning, the Fergus Falls Business Spotlight days, to now, I appreciate you so much because the show has grown, it's adapted at its core, and I promise you I'm going to bring you some more like hyper-local Fergus content in the next couple of weeks because at its core, that's really what the show is. But I love diving into topics as much as I like getting into the history of Fergus Falls, uncovering the businesses. I really love diving into topics with people who are here in our community who aren't necessarily business people, but just have a lot of information about history or other things. So I'm excited to kind of be going off this in this direction as far as more of a human interest podcast, as far as a business podcast. But I just wanted to address the listeners and say that I'm going to get some hyperlocal content going again here for sure soon. But today we're talking about the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire, or rather the Roman Republic, right,
Yep.
Scott?
Yes.
So we'll find out all that stuff. We got Scott Brantner here. Not doctor. You said I could not call you a doctor.
No, unfortunately, I don't have the correct piece of paper for that.
But nonetheless, you are a professor at M State, a professor of history at M State. So I'm excited to hear about you said you really like Roman history. That's like your personal, like, I just geek out on Roman history. I love the movies Gladiator. Like, I love the Gladiator movies.
Sure.
So certainly I'm also a big biblical history, not like Taylor, who I had on my last show as far as biblical history, but I love the history of the Bible, the book of Acts, the early learning about the early years of the Christian church. That really interests me a lot.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much of the Christian church aspect we're going to take, or the Catholic Church aspect, but it all ties in to the Roman Empire, the rise and the fall of it. And then we're also going to talk about some parallels maybe between the fall of the Roman Republic and potentially some things that we might be facing right now in the United States. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's always a fun thought experiment, emphasis on experiment, right? The thing about history is that it's not a crystal ball, but it can give you a little bit of guidance to maybe contextualize and understand some things that are happening right now. And I'd say that's always been the case. It's one of the things I really love about ancient history in particular, and even more in particular Roman history, right? Because you kind of have about 2,000-ish years of a pretty continuous culture and civilization. And within those 2,000 years, almost everything that can happen happened, you know? Oh. So there's always so many great parallels that you can draw just to suss out, not so much what exactly is going to happen today, but kind of get an idea of how do people act in these sort of situations, Yeah.
I love that. Well, I do want to acknowledge and thank, and as always, as I acknowledge and thank my sponsors here, the disclaimer that the, views and opinions expressed by myself or my guests on this show are certainly not reflective of our sponsors. We just appreciate their support on the show. So that gives me freedom to say whatever I want. Not entirely, but very much so. Thank you to Atlas Outdoor Services, Outstate Brewing, Stumbeano's, Victor Lundeen's, Fergus Home and Hardware, Liberty Business Systems, Wayne Schuett with Century 21 Atwood, and Dr. Zack Chiropractic, keeping me straight. So, all right, Scott, I think that the only way to do this is to get a little condensed history of your life before we dive into this. Not that we need to qualify you. I would never want to do that, but just so that people can understand where you've come from to get to M State teaching in Fergus Falls.
Yeah. Hey, it's fair enough to ask. So before I came to Fergus Falls, I've lived here for about a year and a half. I'm a transplant, had never been to Minnesota in my whole life before I moved here. But I applied for a job at the college, got the job at the college, and then drove out to town and bought a house. So I've loved it so far. I've been really really happy living here. It's a great community.
You grew up in Montana, though.
I did not grow up in Montana. Actually, I lived in Montana for 4 years before I came here. And before that, I grew up in Southern California, actually.
Like south of LA or in LA area?
In the LA area, a little bit north of LA. I was born in a beach town called Ventura. Okay. And then, from there, lived in LA a little bit.
Did Tom Petty write a song about Ventura Boulevard?
He certainly did.
Yeah.
Yep. And that is a real boulevard that you can drive down. But I went to college out there after getting my master's degree in history. I decided to join the Peace Corps. Spent a couple years serving in Macedonia in a little village where I taught English to kids. And coming back from that, I started teaching high school at a private school in Los Angeles, moved to Montana where I taught college history. And from Montana, I ended up here in Fergus.
So you left the national park. You were like up right by the national park there, right by Glacier National Park, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the most beautiful places in the country. So you must have got a really sweet offer from M State to move to Fergus.
The sweet offer was a pretty good salary with pretty good health benefits and in a place that is nice and where I could afford to buy a home, which is not the case with Montana right now, unfortunately. The housing market there is just insane. Right.
Yeah, I think that Fergus is awesome. It feels like the land of opportunity because if you're somebody, certainly if you can if you were an average earner in the United States anywhere and you moved from where you were and dropped yourself in Fergus Falls, it must be significantly below average as far as the cost of living here compared to everywhere else in the country.
Yeah.
So we're gonna probably see Fergus Falls grow, I would assume, hopefully. I mean, I don't know. I have conversations about that all the time with people about the direction Fergus is headed.
It's certainly a double-edged sword.
Yeah. So,
and we can talk a little bit about that as it applies to the Roman Republic as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about this. I think we should start maybe by just like kind of laying out the main overview here, because I mentioned we're going to talk about kind of the parallels between maybe what's happening with the decline of the United States Republic versus some things that we've seen with the Roman Empire or the fall of the Roman Republic. I recently read a book here, and I'm not a big book guy. I always see you reading it Outstate, but I'm not a big book guy. But the most recent one I've read was probably about a year and a half ago. It was Ray Dalio's Changing World Order. So highly recommend that book to anyone, certainly if you're into like financial crises and movements. And we'll obviously talk on that as we go through some of the parallels here between what happened in Rome and what's happening here with the United States as far as devaluing currency, all of that stuff. But the idea is that all of these empires run in fairly predictable cycles as far as what causes a decline, usually a rising power, challenging an existing power. There's almost always a war. And then there's something that is on the other end of that looks completely different for the world order after that. So why don't you I'll let you go for a little bit and talk about like, how did the Roman Empire start? Where does the roots of the Roman Empire?
Yeah, so I'm not personally familiar with Dalio's work, but I'd agree with the general gist I'm getting from it, which is that, as someone who teaches for the college, history stretching back from about 1.2 million years ago to maybe, let's say, like the 1990s. There's a whole lot of patterns that you can see in the kind of rise and decline, and then sometimes sudden rise again of different countries, civilizations, cultures. And I find the Roman Empire and the Republic before it particularly interesting for that reason, because as I said, it just was around for so long. So first off, because I think this is a really common thing, there's a little bit of a difference between when you're talking about the Roman Empire versus the Roman Republic. The Roman Empire, generally speaking, most historians will say that gets going about 3127 BC or BCE. same thing. When you have the, securing of power of the first Roman emperor, Augustus Caesar. Up until then, you have a Roman Republic, albeit a pretty dysfunctional republic. And that dysfunction really starts to get going around 134 BC, moving up until, you sort of have the suspension of any kind of representative republic, right? And really what essentially becomes a dictatorship. And that is your kind of dividing line between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. I would actually say we're not really at the Roman Empire yet if you want to draw a comparison between those two civilizations. And, you always got to be cautious when you do this. But
ChatGPT says here, Roman Empire, 27 BC to 476 AD.
Uh-huh.
That's the ChatGPT notes as far as when the Roman Empire started versus, and then before that you had the Republic, and then a little bit after that there was a split between Rome kind of fractured into two entities, correct?
Sure, yeah. Depending on when you're looking at it, it either fractures into two entities, or three or four, depending on the time period you're looking at. So things get pretty dicey in the Roman Empire as well. I would actually argue, and if you're trying to draw a comparison with the kind of evolution of the United States, we're really not there yet. Partly because of time. The U.S. has been around, 250 odd years, or we're approaching the 250th anniversary, I believe. Mm-hmm. The Roman Republic, to put this into perspective, by the time it fell and became a autocracy, a dictatorship that we call the empire, right? It had been around a little less than 500 years. I think one of the things that I like about history and that kind of puts things into perspective is also just the length of time it takes for some of these things to happen. I think a lot of times we sort of talk about, well, it seems like things are maybe not as good as they were in my parents' and grandparents' time, and maybe that means the sky is falling tomorrow. Oftentimes, more often than not, I'd say it takes quite a while for the sky to fall,
Just Dalio's steps here are the 6 cycles, the 6 stages of an empire. Rise through education, innovation, and hard work. Strong productivity and global trade dominance. The peak power, reserve currency status. You saw that with the United States, obviously. Step 4, excessive debt and wealth gaps. We're seeing that now. Step 5, internal conflict and external challenges. We're also seeing that now. Step 6, decline, loss of reserve status, civil breakdown. I don't think we've quite got to stage 6 as far as the stages of an empire, but it's very clear that in post World War II, we came out into a period of very strong productivity. And then you had that peak power, full reserve currency status. And then when 63, when they went off of the bimetallic standard, took silver out of money, that was the first step in that excessive debt, devaluation of currency, and wealth gaps. So what do you know about the currency as far as the role that what currency did the Romans use? I don't want to,
Yeah, that's interesting. So, and this is why one of the reasons, why I always want to caution, it's very fun to draw parallels in history. And I think it's a really interesting thought experiment. Always take it with, anywhere between 50 to 90% seriousness, never 100%, because there are differences. And I think a great example of this is just the fact that the Romans never did develop a symbolic currency. They never developed paper money. Their currency always, to some extent, was metallic. And it was based on the purity of the metal with which their coinage was minted. Now, they do experience very similar kind of inflationary trends or deflationary trends, just like we do with our currency. However, that was usually based on the purity or impurity of the metal with which the coins were minted, right? So your silver coins might be, mixed in with a little bit of copper to kind of, lighten it up. But oftentimes merchants were a savvy bunch. They would realize they would be weighing those coins and they'd realize, hey, these silver coins are a little lighter than they were last week. I think I'm going to ask for more of these for my, cow that I'm selling at market today. And there you go. You've got inflation.
Correct. Yeah, you had, I forget what the period of years was, but one of the comparisons was since 1913, the value of the United States dollar has decreased by over 90%, right?
Yeah.
Since the Federal Reserve was established in 1913 or 1914. But very similarly to what you saw in the debasing of the currency in the Roman Empire towards the end was the content over an X amount of period of years, the content of the metal or the silver in their currency had declined by 90%. So they had debased and devalued the currency that they were using, similar to the crisis we find ourselves in now, Yeah,
I mean, I'd say one caveat to that is that, again, unlike the ancient Romans, we are plugged into a truly global system of trade. Yeah. And so the inflationary trends of our currency have to be compared to the inflationary trends of other currencies around the
globe. It's a fiat crisis. Yeah. We're not the only ones in the world that have, everyone in the world is working off of a system that's backed by nothing right now. Really,
just faith.
I don't want to get too into the financial aspect of it. I want to talk more about the Roman Empire.
Sure.
But I have some guests, John Prishman and Ryan. Oh my gosh, Tungseth. Ryan Tungseth and John Prishman do the Hedgeheads. They run the Hedgeheads podcast, and I'm going to have them on in a couple weeks, and we're going to talk about money, and we're going to talk about commodities and hedging. So if you're interested in that currency topic, we'll get into it more then, but let's stick to the things that you feel like are the most important things that people need to know about the operations of the Roman Empire, the peak of it, maybe the gladiator games in comparison to the sports we have today and the distractions we have today, Yeah.
And
how did that come to be anyways? How did we get to a point in the Roman Empire where they actually started running those gladiator games?
Yeah, it actually goes back really before there was even a city called Rome. Gladiatorial combat was a thing that started out as a religious ritual. The people in northern Italy who were really the most technologically advanced, who were building cities before the Romans even built Rome, the Etruscans, would at funerals celebrate that funeral. It's a pretty dark celebration, but you might celebrate it by having a couple slaves fight to the death. And it's a sort of a form of ritual, celebration, human sacrifices in there, kind of, right? Your human is getting sacrificed by the other human fighting them, but this is done in a religious context. And the Romans kind of absorb a lot of their religion, their social institutions, their traditions from these Etruscans. And that's how gladiatorial combat gets introduced into Roman society and kind of evolves over time from this, originally sort of religious ritual / human sacrifice thing to a sport, an entertainment, a way to profit off of the lives and literal blood of your slaves.
And it was I want to say it was 400 years the Colosseum was operational or something. So this was a very large period of history where people were fighting to the death for entertainment. That's just sick. That is we're a little less barbaric now with the UFC. So,
and again, the Colosseum is something that would be from the Roman Empire. So even if we're talking about the Roman Republic, Colosseum is, just about roughly 100 years in the future from the end of the Roman Republic.
So let's go back to you mentioned Caesar Augustus was the first emperor of Rome.
Yep.
Let's talk about kind of that through the time of Jesus. the Roman Empire. Obviously, at the time, it was very much so, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it was established by like the Jewish church, or was it very much so a religious entity, or was it not a religious entity? Because I thought, or could I be wrong about that?
What are you referring to?
Like, obviously, the Romans put Jesus to death for blasphemy. Like that was the reason that they gave, and it was a lot of Jewish. There was like. It was like Jews and Gentiles, obviously.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Maybe like the political structures there, and like, because I just obviously got off this episode with Taylor where we talked about the Israel and the connection of a religious state. It was Rome, a religious state. Early on, was it?
The Roman Empire as a whole, at the time that Jesus was alive, I think we would recognize more secularism in it than religiosity. This is one of the things that's really interesting about that civilization is the many ways in which it mirrors our own. And one of those ways is in the overall secular nature of life and institutions. Now, religious institutions are there, especially pagan ones in the Roman Empire. In fact, those positions are mixed in with the government. One of the titles that the Emperor Augustus and then later his successor Tiberius, who is emperor at the time that Jesus was alive, will take for themselves is Pontifex Maximus, which means chief priest of Rome. By the way, a title which is now used for the Pope.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was passed on to him
and
later on.
And I had an interesting thought from a coworker who said the Roman Empire never fell; it just became the Vatican. So we can talk about that too. But so ultimately, though, then the religious pressures, obviously Christianity, Nero was a big like turning point in the emperor that was actually like fighting against the rise of Christianity in the first 100 years, correct?
Well, that is a part of the narrative that gets written down much, much later. So one of the difficult things and one of the tasks of approaching this stuff from a historical perspective, and this is exactly the thing that I usually tell students, right, is that if you were looking for a historical version of religious or divine events, you're going to be very disappointed. And that is because to simply do the work of history, it just doesn't work to assume any kind of single spirituality or single ideology as being the correct one. You might liken it to, say, for example, if you are a lawyer in a court and you are trying to defend your client accused of murder, and as part of your defense, you stand in front of the jury and you say, I have here in my hands a letter written by this person saying he totally did not commit murder, case closed, right? You're already assuming that the, evidence you have before you is something that is worth taking at face value.
And this is kind of, I don't want to get too deep into a conversation about like the canonization of the Bible and why scholars certainly take certain parts of the Bible as historical documentation, and there's consensus historical value to them. And then there's obviously certain parts of the Bible that have more dispute amongst scholars, but ultimately that canonization process of the Bible is very thorough. Yeah. It was very, very thorough when they canonized what it was. And so I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to get into that too much as far as like, I don't know exactly where I sit on the Bible as far as it being people will claim it's the infallible word of God, therefore everything that's in it is divine, and I think this was part of the conversation we had with Taylor. It's like, what weight do we put to religious texts when it comes to things like Israel's right to the land or any other thing, So, but yeah, I guess bring it back then and talk about maybe what you think. Because from my perspective, the little bit I've studied is I feel like the Roman Empire was really taken down by the rise of Christianity. I mean, it looks like that. It kind of was, and then got taken over kind of by the Catholic Church and became the Vatican.
Yeah, that's a tough. There's a lot of things in there that can get broken down, right?
Break it all down.
and this is again one of the things I like about history, right? One of the things I think that often people maybe get frustrated with when it comes to learning history or hearing about history from the perspective of historians is that the relatively simple version that most people learn in a textbook, when you're in middle school, high school, even college, a lot of the time someone comes around and says, well, actually, no. And that's frustrating, right? But a big part of history is kind of like doing that in investigation or being that lawyer in a court case. You are not there to arrive at 100% certainty, but what you are there to do is to give an evidence-based argument for what happened, and at the same time to try and persuade other human beings why they should care and why they should listen to you, right? And because that is just baked into the nature of doing history, it means that as new evidence arrives, as new interpretations of old evidence arrives, that story of the past, it does change, right? It has changed. It continues to change. And actually, one of these things that you brought up of Christianity taking down the Roman Empire is a great example of this. The historian who you got that from, even if you don't know his name, is a guy named Edward Gibbon. He was a Scottish philosopher and historian, wrote this huge and groundbreaking text called The History of the Decline and the Fall of the Roman Empire. And his big thesis, because this was popular in the late 1700s, right, was that two, big things brought the Roman Empire down. One was Christianity, and the other was the movement of Germanic peoples into the army. So there are tons and tons of challenges to this, right? There are a lot of ways using evidence you can break down this, this viewpoint. But that said, it kind of has a way of becoming the standard narrative over time, right? So that's one of the interesting things about history is that really, if you're not challenging those narratives or trying to get to a more precise argument based on the evidence, you're really not doing history at all. So right. I can understand why people get frustrated about it a lot of the time. They're like, this is not what I learned in school. Why is this person saying this?
No, I'm not surprised at all. I'm not surprised by that at all. Again, back to the last episode, Taylor explained it really well. Like the statement like terrorism. Well, what is terrorism? Like that is very much so. Like different people are going to look at that in a different way. And like you're expected to think about it in a certain way that it's not actually necessarily what it is. Yeah. And so I love these conversations because I'm not afraid to be taught. I want to be taught. I want to understand more. So certainly. Yeah. So talk about then that 100 to like that 400 years then in the split of the was the split of the Roman Empire due to was that the rise of the Catholic Church that split the Roman Empire or not?
No, definitely not.
Okay.
So Christianity for just about the first 300 years of its existence in the Roman Empire, from the death of Jesus to the adoption of Christianity by the first emperor to do so, Constantine. This is the point at which Christianity becomes a dominant religious force in the empire. Until then, it's a minority, even as it's a growing minority. You kind of have to imagine if, say, suddenly there was an American president who, very powerful and more or less a dictator, and then converts to Islam. Well, what are all the underlings to do? If they want to be close to that president, they're probably going to convert to Islam as well. And this is, a large part of what shapes the transition of Christianity from a relatively small and underground sect. You early on, you might even consider it just a sort of breakaway sect of Judaism, right?
Right.
To a dominant religious but also political force in the Roman Empire.
Yes. That is very much so. Politics and religion, they arose to power together in that 400-year period.
Yeah. And beforehand as well, right? So politics and religion.
Always. Because at the end of the day, the convictions that we have in our hearts and the convictions about the way that the reasons why we're here and the moral obligations we have while we're here, like those are what influences everything we do. And so obviously people are going to fight for those things, and those are going to be the things that people create laws about and people do things about,
And I think what's also very interesting about this history is it is in this moment, this time period, when Christianity comes to the forefront as a political force endorsed by not just the women, slaves, the traditional demographic of underground Christian sects, but by the emperor himself, high up senators, right? It's at this moment when you do get the canonization of all the books of the Bible, when you do get a lot of the
Nicene Creed, can you talk about that a little bit?
The establishment of the idea of Trinity.
Yes.
All of this comes from this time period, 3 centuries after Jesus' life.
Yes. And then Martin Luther came later.
Much later.
Much later. But this was when the Nicene Creed, if anyone's ever... Nicaea, is that what it was? The
Yes.
Council of Nicaea?
That's
right.
It
was where all of this stuff happened, and they decided basically everything that is the roots of the Christian church. I mean, everything was decided by that council there. So
Yeah. And it comes down to the fact that, one of the nefarious things that occasionally happens when a specific group finds itself to be incredibly influential in a relatively short amount of time is you have splinters, you have breakaways, you have infighting, right? This is a thing that had almost always been the case with early Christianity. There were different groups, but it's really after Christianity becomes the dominant religious and political force in the Roman Empire that you have Christians murdering each other in the streets. And the whole reason for the Council of Nicaea was, and this was overseen by Constantine, was to try and attempt to end this fighting and to set a one kind of creed. It kind of works.
It didn't work.
Yeah, it at least established what the creed was gonna be of whoever was close to the emperor. So yeah, but different groups of Christians continued to exist for centuries more, So the
split happened when? After the split, what do you know what when all that happened, and then like the fractures?
Yeah. Do you mean of the empire?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the split happens at various points. And this is one of the things I think that I really like about the long view of history is that if you're talking about the split of the Roman Empire, what you'd really want to say more accurately are splits, because it happens at certain points. At certain points, the whole empire is melded back together, then it splits again, then it's melded back together. So it's only, after the reign of Theodosius, when the empire, splits for good. He's going to be the last emperor who reigns over, and this is we're talking late 300s.
Okay.
That's going to be the last emperor who reigns over a united Roman Empire. But by then, the culture had already changed so much from the distant past and had already been through what you might call several revolutions, certainly several civil wars, and the origins of that very first split really have little to do with Christianity at all. It has to do with the exercise of power. It has to do with political corruption. It has to do with economic disruption and decreasing faith in the institution of the imperial throne. So, again, these are things that are very different from the earlier Roman Republic, which I feel is more reflective of, say, today's events. However, there are absolutely parallels in that one of the most dangerous things that leads to sort of social disruption is first a kind of decay of the services that a government or a type of government provides, and second, a decay in the faith of people.
Right.
That government will serve them.
And like you saw it in 2020, like the breakdown,
right.
January 6th is a perfect example of the breakdown of people's faith in the democratic system and in our ability to have a civic election process that we all feel good about. Like that's where, however you feel about it, it's very, very clear that there is a distrust in us as Americans towards how legitimate we feel our elections may be.
Sure.
So
and I think that's indicative of a lot of things. I'm also not here to make any kind of a big statement about who's wrong and who's right. Again, I like to take the long view, and what I see in that long view is that very, very often in history, the people who are seeking a sort of restoration of faith in a specific system tend to also be the architects of its destruction. A great example of this can be found in the French Revolution. Often it's kind of passed over that in the beginnings of the French Revolution, the most popular word on the streets and the most popular kind of speeches you were going to hear were all about how we support our king and how good King Louis XVI needs to stay in power. We just need to get some of these corrupt ministers out of the way. But, our king loves us. We're going to establish a really, really great, liberal monarchy here. And that gets the ball rolling, and that ball ends with, Louis XVI's head, falling into a basket from a guillotine.
Wow, that's crazy. So, just to kind of give you a few more talking points here, you can go with whatever you want here, but these are the thematic parallels drawn by ChatGPT here. You had the economic overextension. This was the Roman Empire, lavish spending, constant wars, bloated military. Currently in the United States, we have trillions in debt, global military bases all around the world, rising interest payments. We had currency devaluation. We already talked about that. Political instability. We just talked about that. Corrupt elites of Rome. We had assassinations, civil wars. And then we're seeing here in the United States currently deep polarization, government gridlock, and distrust in institutions. Cultural fragmentation. It says here, decline in civic values, class division, and moral decay in the Roman Empire. United States, breakdown of national unity, media echo chambers, and rise of identity politics. We have, go ahead. Interrupt. Yeah, if you had a thought, go ahead. Run with it.
Interesting. Yeah,
I'll finish the rest of those. But yeah,
I think the idea of a rise in identity politics might be going a little far. Simply because I think the way we think of identity is pretty fundamentally different from people in the ancient world. Whether it's political identity, gender identity, race is not a concept that ancient Romans would have understood in the way that we understand it. But I do think that there is maybe a place where you could draw a parallel is a sense of hardening, of grouping and outgrouping, right? Deciding I belong to this group and I am in thick with them, and the people who are outside that group, they don't have my interest at heart. They're my enemies, right? So a kind of lack of intersectionality in society.
Correct. More the social media echo chambers is a very good example of that, though.
Right.
The fact that you can create this whole world you live in online, and you just never have to interact with people who think differently than you if you just block them and just don't interact with those people or don't follow those people. So the other ones here, military issues. It says the Roman Empire, the reliance on mercenaries lacking loyalty to Rome. And then the parallel with that for the U.S. is outsourcing conflicts, war, fatigue, and the veteran crises. I think we see this a lot right now with what's going on in Israel and what's going on with the Ukraine-Russia conflict is the proxy wars that we're fighting here in the United States. We're very much so funding and kind of using other entities in the world to fight our fights. And that is a clear parallel here. You have mercenaries that lacked loyalty to Rome. I think at the end of the day, none of these countries are obviously we've helped them tremendously, but they're not loyal to the United States. Like if you think, probably Israel maybe is, or I don't know how those relationships actually are, but like if you think Ukraine or Israel or a European country that's our ally, if you think that they're like married to us or they are us, you're sadly mistaken. And so very, very interesting when you have other people or you're influencing their fight or you're fighting fights with them, so, and then you had declining infrastructure, it says here in Rome. Roads and cities fell into despair. I don't know. This is kind of a stretch. It says aging. We have aging infrastructure, water crises, which is correct in certain parts of the world, energy grid concerns. I would say I'm not as concerned with our infrastructure here in the United States. Should I be?
This is one of the, I think, spots where I'd like to maybe draw it back to the Roman Republic. Because a lot of what you're talking about is not the decay of a republic in which people elect representatives to represent their interests in the government the way that we have. This is the decay of a autocratic authoritarian system that emerges from the ruins of that old republic. So I would actually say that what's a lot more indicative and perhaps a better comparison, if you're going to draw that comparison between Romans and Americans, which, since the very founding of the country, people have loved to do. If you're going to make that comparison, I would say the Republic is the best way to do it. So to set the stage for that, the Roman Republic really reaches its height territorially and in terms of power and economy after fighting a couple of pretty big wars with a major opponent in the region, Carthage. By the end of the Second Carthaginian War, Rome is controlling, most of Italy, a good part of Spain, southern France. They have, economic control over a large degree of North Africa, the Middle East, the Balkans.
It was huge. The Roman Empire was huge. Yeah. The land grab was huge.
And this is where it starts to balloon and get bigger, right? And you start to see from this point on, again, I think a great parallel you could draw is the U.S. right after World War II, sort of at its height, right? And viewed as a sort of beacon for the rest of the world. Rome's very much there by the end of the Second Carthaginian War. This is 200 BC. By the 130s BC, so 70 years later, roughly where we are right now, past World War II, you start to see things break down. One of the big reasons is because of all that success. Overnight, Rome becomes incredibly rich, incredibly influential, incredibly militarily dominant. All the while, they have a governmental system that was set up to manage a, decently sized city-state, right? And now they're at the head of what, from their perspective, is a global empire. And you start to see things kind of break down, partly because your military is so huge, partly because by then there's a really large wealth disparity. The upper classes that used to say just fight in the army are now the ones kind of sitting on their haunches and buying up land where the poorest people can't afford it. Oftentimes the soldiers can't afford it. And you see how that leads to some pretty desperate attempts at reform and a decay of traditional political institutions and faith in those institutions. So, really good example of this is a guy named Tiberius Gracchus, different from the Emperor Tiberius, who comes much later. Tiberius Gracchus is a war hero. He has fought in a war in Spain that was just a really dragged out conflict. We might compare it to Vietnam. It's a tough conflict, but he is this war hero from this, war. He personally saved the lives of like 1,000 soldiers. And he has their interests at heart, even though he comes from one of these pretty rich aristocratic families. He issues a bill to allot land to soldiers, because what has been going on for a while now is Rome is fighting these wars far, far away from home. While those soldiers are off fighting those wars, they can't tend to their own farms, and a lot of rich senators at home are walking up and saying, hey, I can take care of your family. Why don't you just let me purchase this land for cheap? I'll rent it back to you so you can keep working that land. And you start to have just really extensive plantations, essentially, that are owned by the wealthiest people. So you might come back from fighting for a decade or more to find that the land you had inherited is gone, right? Gracchus tried to fix this by issuing a bill that would take public land and divide it up and give it to soldiers as part of their pension. What did the owners of all that land do? Because this was, basically a proposition to divide up the land of the wealthiest people and give it to these poor soldiers. So what did those wealthy people do? They came up with a new law of their own. They issued what's called a senatus consultum ultimum, or a final decree of the Senate. It was a totally made up thing. It was just new, right? They just kind of winged it. And that, law decreed that, we can declare anyone we want an enemy of the state. And we think this guy's an enemy of the state, so we're going to kill him and his followers. And this is where things start to get dark, right?
What year was this?
This is in 134 BC.
So this is the actual fall of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire?
Well, there's the thing. This is the beginning of the fall of the Roman Republic, but more or less it takes almost 100 more years of dysfunction to really get to the point where the Republic is dead and gone. And even then, the first Roman emperor, Caesar Augustus, is going to spend most of his time as emperor loudly proclaiming how he is the savior of the Republic, even though it's very, very clear on paper this guy is a complete autocrat. He holds all the powers of all the offices that used to be divided among individual legislators and stuff.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah. So another great thing that I think you find in a lot of historical examples of kind of, maybe a teetering system or a fragile system is that it's not just that, people who want to save it or roll it back to its glory days tend to accelerate its destruction. It's also that, oftentimes when you see it completely destroyed is when you also hear people most loudly proclaiming that it's been saved. So, yeah.
Wow. Very, very, very interesting. I know where you're at politically, but I'm glad that we're not getting into that, but it's very much so interesting to hear the perspective, and just see it. I know that I talked about it too with Taylor in the last episode about the whole annexing Greenland or the Panama Canal thing, or these land grab movements. That's a huge part of all of this. If you can't understand anything else, for sure, at the end of the empire, land grabs are happening at the end of the empire. Like that is that prevalent?
Well, at the end of the Republic.
Or right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
And certainly there is territorial expansion going on at that time. And I'm glad you bring up politics. I don't want to draw too many parallels, right? My hope is never to change someone's mind or convince them that things are going to go a certain way. There are always wrenches that get thrown in that you can't predict.
Right.
But I think there are certain patterns to look out for, especially because very, very often in situations where there is a political revolution or an overturning of a formerly established political system. Again, many times people tend to think like I'm safe because I'm on the side of the people who are probably going to win, and they also end up being purged eventually, right? And this is the case even with someone like the first Emperor Augustus, right? He represented himself not just as a savior of the Republic, also a strong supporter of the institution of the Roman Senate, which had traditionally ran the Republic. At the same time, part of his deal that he made with other warlords at a time when civil war was still brewing in Rome, when he was a younger man, part of his deal was to take one of the most well-respected Roman senators, a kind of bulwark of Roman values and traditionalism, a guy named Marcus Tullius Cicero, pretty famous Roman, and to agree to let him be assassinated. Why not? It served his interests to do so at the time. One of the big differences between Augustus Caesar and his adoptive father and great uncle, Julius Caesar, is that Augustus Caesar was much more willing to, simply kill anyone that it was expedient to kill in order to maintain his grip on power. By the time you get to that point, you're talking 100 years on from Tiberius Gracchus and this kind of first shedding of political blood, not just like a subtle thing and out, we're just going to kill this politician because we don't like him, right? You're 100 years on from that with Tiberius Gracchus. And by then, after, almost a century of on again, off again, civil discord, political violence, sometimes out civil war, most Romans were only too happy to accept this deal, right? We'll just have the autocrat because at least the autocrat brings stability. I would say we're not there yet. There's absolutely no inevitable, kind of trend that means the United States will go the same way.
Right.
But one of the reasons I like talking about this stuff is because I think it can show you some red flags in the road, maybe some turns you don't want to take. And one of those turns is the foregoing of the rule of law and the assassination of political rivals in the open simply for the, sake of maintaining institutions.
Interesting.
Even though in the process of doing so, you are destroying the institution because what is there if you're just killing the people who don't agree with you, right?
That's very interesting. That's very, very, very interesting. The last one here that I do want to spend just a little bit of time on, but the bread and circuses parallel between the Roman Empire and us now. So part of that devaluation of currency, debasing of currency, they ran a similar bread stimulus, we'll call it, right? Like the parallels, ChatGPT found some parallels between the bread stimulus and maybe the 2 point whatever $trillion economic stimulus packages that we were given during COVID, or that like times. I mean, obviously there was economic, those stimulus package, those stimulus checks, those have to draw some parallels as far as some stuff throughout history too.
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, what are the bread and circuses? What were the bread and circuses in the Roman Empire?
Pane et circenses. So that's the kind of phrase that comes out in Latin, and it actually comes from much later. So again, one of the things we have to be careful of is that people have been writing about Roman history ever since there were still ancient Romans. And those ancient Romans of different eras would look back on their own history with the Roman Empire and have their own kind of views on it, largely anchored in what they were experiencing in their own time, just like we do now, right? All the time. So this comes from later writers at a time when Christianity was gaining, steam, and a big theme that starts coming out, especially from Christian writers of Roman history who themselves were living in the Roman Empire, is that, these people who were non-Christians, they were decadent. And so the idea of bread and circuses comes up. The bread and circuses themselves sort of run a through line all the way through Roman history. Christians continued gladiatorial combats in the Colosseum for a time. After a while, they stop the human combats and they just go to humans versus animals, which I suppose is better. But you're still having a bunch of people just watch folks kill exotic animals for entertainment. It's not awesome. It kind of depends on what you view as decadent entertainment, and that is a thing that is heavily rooted in the time and the viewpoints in which you live, and it's going to be a moving target as well, right? Mm-hmm. The ancient Romans, we're going way back to the Republic, right? They certainly would not say that gladiatorial combat is decadent, because they would say this is the lot of a slave. It's what they are, it's what they're here for. Now, the slaves themselves were human beings. They didn't always agree. In fact, there are some very large slave revolts in the late Roman Republic that take place. Led by gladiators in some cases. The most famous is the Spartacus Rebellion.
300, the movie 300?
No, you're thinking of Sparta, which is
Sparta!
A town in ancient Greece, so different from the Romans. Spartacus was the name of a slave who was from Thrace, an area north of Greece, around where Bulgaria is today. But he led a revolt during the late Republic. And this is just one of those many kind of societal shocks that was hitting again and again and again throughout this, roughly 100 years from the first really significant outbreak of political violence in the Roman Republic to its transition to a complete autocracy.
Huh. Well, I will say some guests, there's some episodes where I really struggle to fill an hour worth of content. We're already there, and I feel like we're going to go for, probably another chunk of time here. However long you want to talk. I don't want to cap this off because I feel like there's still some things we got to get to here, like the fall of the Roman Empire, or as far as or how did the borders become Rome? Like you have the country of Rome now, which is very small. And you have Vatican, which is a city and a country, even smaller, which if we're going to go off of, what the Council of Nicaea, they are in the Vatican today, right? I don't want to say this, they are, but
the Nicene Creed is a pretty big part of Catholicism. Yes.
Correct. And so that is sort of let's just say for entertainment purposes here, the Vatican is what's left of the Roman Empire. How did everything get consolidated down? Obviously you have the Byzantine Empire. Never heard of that. And then you have so they kind of were the world power that arose. The
poor Byzantines.
The Byzantine. Okay.
So the Byzantines, it's funny because most people haven't heard of them or don't know as much about that as they do about the classical Roman Empire.
Obviously, yeah.
And it's sort of unfair because they are the eastern half of the Roman Empire. It's how they start out. In fact, Byzantine is kind of a misnomer. They called themselves Romans. They continued to do so, and they lasted into the late Middle Ages. 1453. is when Constantinople, the capital of that Byzantine Empire, named after that first Christian emperor, Constantine, who headed the Council of Nicaea. 1453 AD is when that city finally falls to the Ottoman Empire. So depending on who you ask, Roman history, stretches from about, from 752 BC all the way to either 472 AD or 1453 AD.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You nailed the dates, by the way, on the ChatGPT. You nailed the dates there. So it does say here the Byzantine Empire. Then you had Islamic caliphates, the Mongol Empire, then the Ottoman Empire's peak.
Right. And also we have to, be careful here because I think it's really easy to look at history as a kind of straight timeline. But
correct. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. The Umayyads, the Mongols, the Ottomans, well, not so much the Umayyads, but the Mongols and the Ottomans, these are peoples that intersect with each other, influence each other. The Byzantine Empire exists alongside the Umayyad Caliphate for a very long time. It exists alongside the Abbasid Caliphate and successive caliphates after the Umayyads break up. All the way through continuously, they really did think of themselves as Romans. There's a great anecdote that I really like about how in 1834, Greece, the country of Greece today, the modern country of Greece, went into revolt against the Ottoman Empire. They were part of the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. These were Christians, right, as opposed to Muslims, most of the inhabitants of the Ottoman Empire. They went into revolt, and it was a sensation across Europe. A lot of Brits got really into it and went to join the Greek Revolution for their, independence. But the story goes that one of these British admirals who had lent his fleet to the Greek cause was sailing around one of the many, many small islands all around, between Greece and Turkey. He arrives at one of these islands, and he brings the people of that island the wonderful news: hey, you Greeks, you're all free. You have your own country now. And the story goes that the person he's talking to replies, "What are you talking about? Greeks? We're Romans." Right? And this is in the 1800s, right?
Oh, dang.
Yeah.
Dang.
And you have to consider that, when you're looking at ancient history, the kind of high point of the ancient Greek city-states and Sparta, Athens, that kind of thing, right? Far more time for the Greeks is spent under Roman rule.
So how did obviously over many, many, many years, countries were established and land was, or was it, like I said, the rise of Rome wasn't built in a day. Rome didn't fall in a day either, right?
Yep.
So that land consolidation to where the borders of Rome is today, that happened over hundreds of years, 1,000 years.
Yeah. It's part of the history of most of the Middle Ages. How you get to Rome being, going from this empire to a city, and occasionally being part of the Papal States.
That's right. I've kept calling Rome a country. I think I've called Rome a country now a couple times. It's a city. Rome is a city, and the Vatican is a smaller city within the city.
Yeah,
interesting.
And again, it's one of those things that leads to some of this instability over time, that oftentimes people have a sort of, semi-religious attachment, I'd say, to political institutions that they believe are just inherent to, their society, their culture, the way to run it. The Romans are no different. And their system that was designed to run a city and did it really well for centuries simply broke down when they got large enough, wealthy enough, militaristic enough, corrupt enough.
Wow. Interesting. Very interesting. So then obviously we mentioned the Mongol Empire, the Ottoman Empire. it said like the peak of the Spanish Empire. And if you want to talk about any of these, you can. If you feel like there's more to add when I go through any of these, just to kind of bring us to where we are today. But the British Empire peaked, it looks like 1815 to 1914. And then you had the Soviet Union sort of in that in-between period. The Soviet Union was the world dominator prior to, obviously, World War II. The United States, it says here.
Well, a third of the world.
A third of the world.
Not necessarily the entire world. That's kind of why there was a Cold War, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. But they certainly were a big economic power, or,
Sure.
So obviously our current status is, I think the United States is still, the US dollar is technically still recognized as a world reserve currency. But I think that is, I think if you went to other parts of the world, it's not. I think there's parts of the world that are already behind or past that, as far as I know that the Saudis and China have been trading oil with no attachment to the US dollar at all. And so that's happening around the world. You're starting to see commodities move away from that. But certainly that world reserve status, I don't know exactly when that was gained, but it really was as a result of the war. And then we kind of messed that up, I think, with as far as moving away from the bimetallic standard. But anything else you want to add about any of these other empires in their reigns, or like any other little nuggets that you think are relevant to maybe, I mean, are we in a decline? Is the United States really in a decline? Like, I think it's easy to point to some of these things like the excessive debt and the wealth gaps and the internal conflicts we're having, and it's clear that there's something going on here. Whether or not it's, it's not going to fall overnight, this will probably be stretched out over decades, but there is probably a rising power, probably China, probably Russia, BRICS. I mean, the BRICS nations are definitely rising up to challenge the United States as a global power as far as control over the money and that sort of thing. But I don't know. You got any thoughts?
It's really hard to say. I think it's fair to say that the world is becoming much more multipolar than it was throughout most of the post World War II 20th century. Is that going to be a bad thing for the United States? Maybe not. And I think that you can look at perhaps the British Empire as an example here, right? At one point, at its height, the British Empire, by just sheer area of land that they control, is the largest empire in all of human history.
Dang.
Yeah.
What did that? What land was that? Stretch that out.
So they had colonies, colonial possessions in Africa, in Asia, in India being one of the largest, the largest colony, in Southeast Asia. So, and of course, most famously in North America. The expansion and contraction of that empire, we wouldn't say that it's a collapse of British civilization, right? And in fact, we can look right now at Britain as a country, no longer an empire by any stretch, right? They've got the Commonwealth sort of, a more handshake, kind of polite connection to many of their former colonies, including Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, places like that, right? Australia. But we wouldn't say that British civilization or culture has collapsed, right? And I think this idea of collapse, again, sometimes maybe gets in our head because of some of the really compelling historical narratives of the past.
Like Nazi Germany falling and epic Roman empires, now Rome's just a city and all this stuff. Just,
And a big
epic
part of
collapses. Because epic collapses are fun to look at,
And it's dramatic and it actually, this is I think a great kind of tying it back, the whole idea of a collapse being this kind of calamitous thing, that also largely goes back to this really influential historian, Edward Gibbon, who wrote about the collapse of the Roman Empire and was, in his day, in late 1700s, we're talking around the time of and post the American Revolution, anxieties in Britain were high about, is our empire about to collapse, right? Because we've lost these American colonies. No, it didn't. It kept on going, but was it slowly shrinking? Was it changing? Absolutely. Is Britain gone? No. It's still a wealthy country. It's still culturally influential.
Like if you're expecting the United States to fracture away into Minnesota's a country and the United States doesn't exist, it's not happening anytime soon. It's unlikely that happens anytime soon.
Not impossible, but not. I would say not likely. And I think regardless, the kind of cultural influence of the United States, of American culture, I think that's probably a substrate that is likely to stick around in some form, even if there are changes. So these kind of sudden, violent shocks and collapses that we tend to fear, when we look back in history, a lot of the time, as often as not, they're more drawn out than we tend to think they will be.
History, you look at history and, we've had conversations about, we think about anything as if it's a far enough in the past, like if it happened out of my lifetime, it just is, I'm so far detached from that. That happened so long ago, when in reality, history, when it was happening, is happening exactly the way life is happening now. Very, very slow, day by day, year by year, decade by decade, things are unfolding over 100-year periods, 1,000-year periods, So, all right, some takeaways here. According to my notes here, cycles repeat. So history shows all empires rise and fall due to common patterns. We talked about those. Decline isn't always doom. We talked about that. The British transitioned power peacefully. Rome obviously did not. But nonetheless, like, if you're whatever, we will find our place. Like, you can find your place if you once were this huge global power entity. You don't have to necessarily play that role in the world anymore, and you can still survive.
It also depends on how you look at it, right? Like with the collapse of the Roman Empire, one of the reasons we talk about it and use the word collapse, even though it's drawn out over such a long time period, is that when we're going over history, these things tend to condense, right? We tend to talk about one big event, followed by another big event, followed by another big event, and lose sight of the fact that maybe there was like 25 years between these two, there was like 50 years between these over here, there's 70 years here. So pretty much any time that human beings have been alive, the vast majority of people just kind of live their lives day to day. That's mostly what almost all human beings do. Most people throughout history are not actively fighting in a war or civil war or dying in a genocide. It's the scope of history for most people is largely just people being people. And that is, by the way, not at all to try and downplay the absolute tragedy of wars, genocides, civil wars, right? Because it is shocking and devastating. But I think this is a thing that a lot of people lose sight of in history because we tend to be so absorbed by just the big things that happen. That we forget that like most people were not doing that.
We're looking for big, huge signs when really there's genocide happening in the world now. That's like history will look back at this period of time and pull things out of this period of time that we're living in right now. The coronavirus, this whole period of time is going to like be a chapter in a history book somewhere down the road that is like very much so just a condensed shell of what we're all experiencing right now. And there's stuff going on that we're not even paying attention to or privy to at all that the history books will write about.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, the last global pandemic on the scale of coronavirus, and even larger scale, was the Spanish flu pandemic right after World War I. That took around, I want to say the ballpark figure is like 30 million died. And also it's often sort of just part of a textbook chapter on World War II. It's kind of a thing we go over. Right.
This is going to be different. Coronavirus is, I mean, obviously there's the geopolitical tensions that arose from it, being that it came from a certain region of the world that is where, I mean, that is the power. If you want to talk about the power that's rising to challenge the United States global power, global position, it's China. So you have this thing that comes out of this region, and there's a lot of questions as to I think more of those questions are being answered now. I think that, I mean, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole about the coronavirus, but like nonetheless, like you're going to look at this and this is going to be a huge period of history, and it's just going to be like a day-to-day part of our lives, so that's how all history is. Nonetheless, though, just to wrap up our core takeaways here, the United States still holds some very key advantages as far as, the innovation we have. Obviously, our military strength, our Navy, our Air Force, global allies, we are very much so positioned to, I guess, win any physical fight we need to win, which sounds ridiculous because that can't be what we resort to here. We have to absolutely, the solution here has to be investing in education, rebuilding institutions, fiscal discipline, absolutely fiscal discipline to get out of this debt we're in. And we need some unity. Those are the unity. If we're not united, if we're just torn apart, we're for sure going to crumble and fall.
Yeah, I mean, I would even argue that's perhaps a lot more important than, my perspective anyways, is that's more important than any kind of economic or even political reform, right? We can look at a economic situation that's much more dire than any we're experiencing today, the Great Depression. And a big difference there, there are people in the Great Depression who kind of wanted to see about staging a coup. There's groups that were pretty radical, pretty extreme at that time, as you would expect. I'd say, in my opinion, one of the main reasons that the United States didn't kind of fall apart or undergo a sort of revolution or uprising at that time was simply because of a more of a kind of unity among people. And also the election of FDR, who took pretty strong action to reassure people. And actually, if you talk to like economists who look back at the Great Depression, super debatable whether anything FDR did fixed the Depression. I'm not trying to suggest that, but it made people feel like someone was trying to fix it for them, right?
It was a Band-Aid for a little period of time.
Well, and perhaps even more importantly, it made people feel like the folks at the top cared about them and were trying to do something about their situation.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
But someone else who knows more about American history than me can probably get into more nuance on that than I can.
Yeah. Well, Scott, I really appreciate your time, you coming on and doing this. Do we need to add anything else? Do you have like thoughts that you wanted to talk about that we didn't get to talk about today or didn't come up?
Only that I think when you look at a sort of a buffet of the of modern political revolutions going back to the 1700s, I'd say one of the things that sticks out to me personally is that the number one thing that seems to lead to stuff going off the rail is just apathy. People become very cynical about what they can do to improve their community and their society. They become very cynical about civic and political participation. And when you look at, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the majority of people in that story are not the ones who are carrying out a coup or, purging the country of their enemies. The majority of people are ones who are trying to stay out of it because at that point they are so cynical about any regime that they just want to step back and live their lives. And that creates an opportunity for a small group to impose themselves.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate your insight on this topic. I don't think we got controversial at all. Like, I don't think there's anything in there that I need to say, don't come at me or my sponsors. But again, I will give the disclaimer.
I hope so, yeah.
Yeah, I will give
try
the
and avoid
disclaimer.
that.
Yeah,
I really don't want to, yeah.
I will say that certainly none of the opinions that were represented in this episode are reflective of Leighton Media or my sponsors, which are Atlas Outdoor Services, Outstate Brewing, Stumbeano's, Victor Lundeen's, Fergus Home and Hardware, Liberty Business Systems, Wayne Schuett with Century 21 Atwood, and Dr. Zack Chiropractic. So, Scott, thank you very much, man.
Thank you.
You'll have to come back. You have to come back for another historical topic at some point. We'll do a deep dive into something else,
Sure thing.
pick a new topic for sure.
Yeah.